So moving down the agenda then, we've done welcome and apologies, done a note, item 2 about sound recording. Item 3, announcements. Don't think there are any announcements. And item 4, public questions. I don't think there are any of those.
No.
Urgent items, if I can move to that and perhaps ask the Chief Constable or someone from SYP to make a comment on this. I mean, clearly we've had the murder in Sheffield over the weekend, and that's caused a lot of distress and disturbance in communities, for the family themselves, of course, and for the community and for the city itself. And I think there's been this sense that is communicated to me, people texting and emailing and phoning, saying that they have this feeling that violence is creeping up again, and they want some kind of reassurance around that. So I'll ask the Chief Constable if he could say something about that in a second. I also wanted to say something myself about the need for communities to support not just the police, but all the emergency services when things like this happen, these incidents happen, because we know that there have been instances of emergency service workers being inhibited in the work that they seek to do, and in some cases abused in what they're trying to do when they're only trying to keep us safe. So I do think that there's an urgent need for the community itself to think about what's happening here in some of these incidents and to make sure that they enable the emergency workers to do their job, which after all is just about keeping us safe. But Chief Constable, if I could ask you to say perhaps a word of reassurance for us.
Commissioner, it's the Deputy. I was just going to give a bit of a quick update, just because obviously we had the incidents over the weekend. I mean, I think the broader context is that the county and certainly Sheffield in terms of major cities remains comparatively a safe place to be. That's not to say that we aren't, of course, aware of the incidents of violent crime that we've had, particularly knife and firearms-enabled crime, which do, as you're well aware, remain a consistent focus for us. I think the point you make about the difficulties emergency services and probably the police more acutely see at the moment is there is a good deal often hostility from some areas towards the police. We still get great support from the vast majority of people, but that was probably evidenced in the incident over the weekend. And as clearly you're aware, there's an ongoing murder investigation, and we have our teams engaged in that. You'll know that we have a very good track record in the tragic circumstances where people suffer the most serious crimes. We do almost entirely bring people to justice, and we'll obviously look to maintain that pace in this position. But it was a very difficult situation for our people. There was a significant number of people on the streets. We, of course, were focused on trying to get to the gentleman who tragically died and render support to him. But it's fair to say that there were people there who, even as officers were trying to render first aid, were being aggressive and hostile to them. It was difficult to get resources to the gentleman in question because people had blocked the roads with cars and the like. And as I say, as our officers were trying to render first aid, they were being threatened by other people in the crowd, and that clearly presented difficulties. I think you're quite right. We will tackle this. We will deal with it effectively. You've seen really robust action over the last few weeks where we've taken, I think, 11 firearms off the street in just the last couple of weeks alone. There's an awful lot of work that goes on that. You are, of course, aware because you arranged the funding and it sits under you, the Violence Reduction Unit. So we're not just looking at the harder-edged enforcement aspects. We are looking at the longer-term public health approach to try and reduce the causes of violent crime in our communities. But that clearly is going to take some time to start seeing the benefits of all the efforts that's going in. So we are concerned about these incidents. We still remain a safe city and a safe area. That's not to say we're complacent, and we will obviously throw all our endeavours in making sure that people responsible for violent crime are put before the court.
Thank you. Yes, I think this twin approach of coming down hard enforcement combined with preventative measures, which is really what the Violence Reduction Unit is about,
Councillor Weatherall
is the way we'll get on top of this.
Has joined the conference.
But as you say, this weekend has been disturbing for people. Thank you very much. Did anyone else from SYP want to comment on this? Shall we leave it there then and move on to, if I can also say under the heading of urgent items that just to put people in the picture, I have been having conversations this past week with other police and crime commissioners, with civil servants and ministers about the comprehensive spending review, which is now underway in government. This is the government's 3-year look ahead.
Has joined the conference.
To determine the overall spending envelope that the government will have during that period for all the different departments of state. So we were very anxious to say to the Home Office civil servants who are going to be dealing with Treasury ministers during the time of this conversation that here are the things that you need to cover and to think about. So, for example, we know that the council tax base is being eroded because businesses are falling away in this period. That's going to put pressure onto council tax, the recovery of council tax. But we know that the government is committed to the uplift in the number of police officers. But if you're going to have police officers, you also need supporting services with them. And if you're not funding that, then that puts us in a very difficult position. I'm bound to say that the civil servants listened very carefully to what all the PCCs were saying, the points we were making, and they would take them up with the Treasury. But they are indicating to us that this year is going to be a very hard settlement. It's going to be very difficult after the initial period of throwing a lot of money at the coronavirus and all the economic impact that that's having, that there is a sobering up, I think we could say, going on in Whitehall now. And they are indicating to us this is not going to be an easy year for any department, but certainly not for policing either, when we come to hear what the settlement will be for the police grant. So just to tell us all that we're going to have those really, very difficult conversations as we go forward now. So moving on from urgent items, item 6, there's nothing to be considered in the absence of the press or public. Item 7, are there any declarations of interest? Item 8, minutes of the last meeting. This is pages 1 to 12. I don't think there's anything in there that I want to comment on. Is everybody happy with the minutes?
Yes.
And then we have the actions, the matters arising from the minutes. That's on page 13. And Erica, I think both of those can be discharged.
Yes, Commissioner. The one's on the agenda for today, and the other talks to a revised template for district reports, and that will happen from next month's meeting.
All right, thank you very much. On then to force performance and item 10, and it falls to the Barnsley district. We're looking at the force performance there this week, and this is the last time we'll use the non-template form of report. So thank you, Superintendent Martin Jones, for the report from the Barnsley district. What we do at Public Accountability Board is we assume everybody's read the report, and then I dip in at different parts of it and ask you some questions around that. And then if you feel there's anything that you really want to say that we haven't covered in that, and it is a very comprehensive, quite a full report, then I give you a chance to do that at the end. So if you're happy with that, we'll press on with agenda item 10, then the Barnsley District operational delivery update. And perhaps I could begin, Mark, by saying that I've had a flurry of emails over the weekend and towards the end of last week around a particular issue which we know has arisen before in the Barnsley District. If I could just mention this to you for you to take note of, and I don't know whether you want to say anything particularly around it now, but one of the items that you've got in your report concerns speeding in the Courton Wood area, and these are other speeding issues. If I just say where they're coming from. So yes, we've had issues of speeding around Courton Wood and the Dearne Valley, and I know you've done a lot of work around that, and you may want to say something about that because you've got that in the report. But But I've also had now emails in from people who are talking about the Darfield Road to Edenthorpe Lane, racing, a rat run they call it, and speeding. Ardsley, Doncaster Road, the dual carriageway again being used for speeding. Barnsley Road in Cudworth and Sidcup Road in Cudworth. And again, similar issues about speeding. It's as if things which we've known about for some time all seem to be recurring again now. With a particular urgency, and it may be that it's, I don't know, it's post-COVID and the pressure cooker, the lid comes off and people start to behave in this, but it is clearly causing some concern. Now, it is on page 24 in your report, so if you're happy, I'll leave that at that, and we'll come to it eventually as we go through the report.
Absolutely, yep.
So turning to the report, if I go past the summary and look at the pages which talk about the impacts of COVID, and I'm on page 19 now, and in page 19, item 4.4, and this concerns the lockdown and what happened to children in particular during this time, and children that were at risk, people we were worried about, as the schools began to close and therefore information was not being easily made available. I just wonder if you could say something to expand a little on what you've got there, because you talk about checks and safeguards were being undertaken to protect them as vulnerable. And I just wonder what you did to do that and what you think the successes of that were, or the drawbacks of that were. So this is page 19.
Obviously, this references the fact that with the close down of the schools and with a lot of the impact on partners in terms of usual methodology of working, which is close contact with the vulnerable victims and the families themselves, getting that information through referrals was somewhat difficult and challenging, and a huge concern in terms of that hidden harm that was occurring that normally comes to us through that methodology. So in discussion with the Safeguarding Partnership, what we did is we prioritised check around all of the particular vulnerable victims and families that we were aware of to make sure that we had that constant dialogue with them, what was happening, to make sure that we were monitoring that proactively rather than we normally receive a lot of referrals reactively. So it was about making sure we had that proactive engagement in place, particularly through the schools as well, because they have a lot of informal out-of-school networks, as well as the during-school networks, and obviously that they were impacted by the lockdown with students not attending the schools. So it was very much a case of making sure that all the relevant resources were doing that proactively so that we could see what was happening, monitor as much as possible whether there were any indications that we were missing anything through that. I'm pleased to report that since the lift of lockdown, those referrals and that the level of communication that we've got has returned to where it was before, which is reassuring in the sense that we now have that insight into potential for hidden harm and the issues around children's social care and the schools back to where it was pre-COVID.
Thank you. So
Tracy Webster.
You think you're on top of that?
Has left the conference.
Yes, I think so. I mean, we would never want to be complacent around that, and lockdown has lifted, but it hasn't completely gone. We're now going into the summer months, so the schools are closed anyway. So I think it's something that we will continue to be very careful and clear about, particularly as we go back into the school situation in September, to monitor where exactly we are. We're very aware and very focused on the fact that we can't afford to lose sight of what's happening as much as possible. And that's certainly a partnership-based approach.
Yeah, thanks very much. Just over the page, on page 20, you refer to, top of the page, the rise in antisocial behaviour. And I wonder whether we've noticed before a rise in fly tipping across the county, and I wondered whether the ASB that you're noting here is of a different order, or whether it's that and other things as well, including the things I began with about speeding boy racers, etc. Yeah,
we've sat down and analysed this as a partnership. it's undoubtedly COVID linked. We haven't seen the levels of reporting that are reflected in the report since 2017, January 2017. So that's a long time ago, reflecting the long downward trend of ASB in Barnsley over that period. The increase is definitely, certainly in the early stages, linked to the health protection regulations. And both ourselves and I've sat down with Paul Brannan, Head of Community Safety for Barnsley for BMBC, and we're in no doubt that it is linked to those regulations and the issues built up within communities during that time within neighbourhoods, and certainly the degree of fear around COVID. As that's progressed, the levels are reducing back to the pre-COVID sort of levels, but there is a slight change in it. You're absolutely right, Commissioner. There is an element of different types of behaviour being reflected in that. The speeding is one of them, and I'm sure we'll discuss that when we get to it. Some of the disruption around our town centres has been displaced as a consequence of the COVID lockdown and finding housing for some of the communities that have been more vulnerable around the COVID issues. I'm pleased to say that we are getting back to those pre-COVID issues, but again, what it has flagged up for us as a partnership is a need for a cohesion and resilience strategy, which we're currently formulating because we're concerned that as a consequence of this, some of the division that might have created within some of our communities and neighbourhoods, we wouldn't want to see perpetuated in a post-COVID scenario. So we are looking at that to see what we can do to reduce the impact of that moving forwards.
Okay. So it's maybe something we need to just keep an eye on, and we'll come back to.
Absolutely, I think so.
If I take you to page 21, 5.4, sorry we kind of dodge around in this way, but
that's all right, not a problem.
The way we can do it sensibly. Investigations and outcomes. I noticed you talk about the new, well, you are having new recruits now, and South Yorkshire Police are going to have a lot of new recruits over the next year or two. And inevitably, the new people that are lacking in experience. And I wonder whether this was a bit of an issue for you in Barnsley, because I don't think you have a tutor unit in Barnsley, do you? So you're putting new recruits directly alongside more experienced officers. And I wonder whether that was putting some pressures on the organisation. Perhaps you could say a little word around that.
It's a nice challenge to have. We are getting a lot of new officers through. Keen as mustard, absolutely, but lacking a little bit of experience, as you say. In terms of how we are structured in Barnsley, we have a central team that oversees all of our new students and makes sure that they are getting the exposure and experience and training that's required. We place them with trained and dedicated tutors, largely on the response teams to give them that exposure to the fast-time reactive policing that is the sort of bread and butter of what we do on a day-to-day basis. But we're also looking to expose them into some of our more specialised worlds. They have a secondment into neighbourhoods. They have a secondment into the DA team, secondment into CID, where we oversee their sort of introduction to those elements. There are some challenges with that. Largely in terms of just trying to make sure that we get their capabilities up to speed. So, for example, when they first come to us, then they're not able to drive in a certain way in terms of response policing. So we have to incorporate that and make sure we factor that into how we deploy them, so that it doesn't impact on our ability to respond as swiftly as possible. But certainly, we've made sure that we're looking at training for all of the constables on the district in a way that, with them all being so new, we need to try and make sure that we can maximise their capabilities on the district. Yeah,
and as you said, it is a good problem to handle.
Absolutely.
Good bunch to have to deal with. On to page 22, neighbourhood policing, item 6, towards the bottom of the page there. You talk about you've now got 6 neighbourhood teams, if I'm reading this right, in the Barnsley district, which correspond to the 6 districts that the local authority organises itself. And it does seem to me that the working relationship between the council and the police is very strong in Barnsley, not least because you've got this coming together of your teams and their districts. And I wonder if you could just say a word around, are any of them co-located?
Absolutely. I think neighbourhood policing has been long embedded in Barnsley, and is a positive success. It's probably the example that we use and try and proliferate across South Yorkshire. Certainly in terms of our engagement, SYP's engagement with BMBC, that's completely joined at the hip, if you like. We are embedded both physically as well as financially with BMBC and operationally. So we've got a joint base at Barnsley Police Station. We have a joint base in the town centre with BMBC staff as well. So the town centre team is co-located with BMBC resources. The SNS hub, which is about problem solving and demand reduction, is jointly based with BMBC and Berners-lee Homes at the main station at Churchfields. So, and I think that's just an indication of how absolutely joined at the hip neighbourhood policing is with our partners in Barnsley. It's a real success story, and you can look at virtually any metric across Barnsley in terms of the positive impact that neighbourhood policing's brought in the last 3 years since it was reintroduced.
No, I think looking at it in a sense from the outside, it does seem to be important to you and a secret of the success, if you like, of the SYP in the Barnsley district. I wonder if I could ask I don't know whether the Deputy Chief or the Chief wants to answer this, or one of the other officers, as to whether these sorts of arrangements are left to the district commanders, or is this something that, I'm talking about the relationship between the way the local authorities organise, the way SYP are organised. Is that left to local district commanders, or is that something you're trying to get across the piece?
Chief, do you want to go or should I go?
Yeah, I was just going to. I was going to say it's important, of course, that we reflect local relationship will undoubtedly inform the way in which the operating model characterises itself. However, that is not to say that we have a laissez-faire approach to this. What we have within the operating model is a requirement for the notion of joint problem solving facilitated through teams, neighbourhood teams, where there will be an element of co-location, there will be an element of course, working very closely together with partner agencies. So if you like, those tenets are writ large across the operating model, and the expression of those tenets is tested through our performance reviews and the way in which we hold district commanders to account. That is not to say, however, that we have a very clear identikit model which must be replicated in each and every district, because some of the relationships have different levels of maturity, different financial modelling, different contributions from local authorities, and some of the structure that sits behind those means of working together are similarly different, and therefore we allow the district commanders with chief execs of local authorities and together with respective stakeholders to fashion that which works locally. Ultimately, of course, the proof of the pudding is in the eating as to whether those local arrangements are delivering what it is that the operating model demands, and the balance in all of that is our ACC local policing who make sure that there is that broad reach across between all of the districts, and that the delivery reflects the very best of practice. And so it's, in some respect, it's a tight, loose arrangement, but it does seem to work pretty well.
Yeah, I understand that. And a very good example on page 23, 6.11, where you've got the shared accommodation team. That seemed to me a really good example of the way this can work. And I must say the scheme that PC Paul Davis, Cannabis Grow, has initiated there just seems to me a remarkable innovation and really, really very good work. And it troubled me a little bit when I saw the headline, Cannabis Grow Scheme, SYP. I wonder what on earth you were up to, but it is a very good scheme. Perhaps you could just say a little word around that, Mark.
Yeah, to be fair to Paul, this really is his idea and innovation. It was identified through the S&S hub. There was a particular number of common denominators around the illegal production of cannabis. Paul's been working with Berners-Lee Homes and BMBC Community Safety around that, and as a consequence of what emerged from that work, he identified a whole number of key criteria where, one, we can identify what's happening and where it's happening. Two, we've identified actions that we can take, but in conjunction with partners that they can take in terms of we can spot it earlier, we can prevent it. That's led to some enormously successful interventions in terms of seizures. But more importantly, we're really starting to grow the register of local and private landlords who are keen to become involved, so because they don't want to see their properties utilised in this way. So it's a real success story between both private and public agencies. Paul's put it forward with district support through the Force Innovation Scheme, and it looks like it will be adopted, invested in, and spread across the county, such has been the success in it here in Barnsley.
That's good news, because I imagine it's the same issue wherever you go across South Yorkshire. So this is a really good way of making some progress in terms of drugs in the county. Thank you.
Absolutely, and it reads across into other areas as well, particularly around exploitation of vulnerable people.
Yes.
And that's been a success as well.
Which is a big issue, yes. If I take you to the bottom, page 24, this is the speeding, the antisocial use of vehicles in various parts of the borough, which I commented on at the beginning, and I wonder if you wanted to say a little word around that, and David Hartley may want to say something too, because I think you've got a gold group on this. Mark?
Yep, absolutely. Boss, I don't know if you want to come in first, or are you happy for me to pick it up?
I think Mr. Hartley will be delighted for you to pick it up, because it's Mr. Forbury who's got the gold group.
Right, okay, no worries. Yes, Commissioner, I think you mentioned the speeding across the district in a number of different locations. Speeding regularly features in our community's top 10 list of priorities. The approach to speeding, it is an antisocial behaviour. The solution to it isn't always simple. It definitely requires that partnership approach. So we are working with BMBC, the Highways and Safer Roads Partnership, around some of the local implementations that need to be delivered to tackle this. Some of it's around engineering, some of it's around education. Some of it, which is definitely our responsibility, is around enforcement, and our neighbourhood police teams have been doing a number of enforcement activities around that. You'll notice underneath 6.21, where we're talking about the speeding, there's also the associated issue around off-road bikes. That is an extension of this type of behaviour, where people are using vehicles on or off roads to act in an antisocial way. I think something we have seen that we're aware of, this is increasingly county-wide. We've had the car cruises recently that came across all four boroughs of the county and ended up leaving the county and being particularly active in Barnsley. We are working with our RPG teams to make sure that we get to grips with that sort of antisocial behaviour. We definitely need to focus on some of the enforcement to make sure that our communities are happy that we're tackling it, but it's not necessarily a straightforward solution. So that's something we definitely need to have that county-wide plan, and we're on with that with our RPG and with BMBC in terms of how we're going to tackle it.
Yes.
Commissioner, Commissioner, I could just come in at this point. You're absolutely right, there is a goal group. But just to give that broader context that Mark referred to there around the support from the road policing group and the OSU department, Chief Inspector Darren Starkey has got the lead for this. We've now got a force trigger plan for any form of car cruisers or racers, and that's very much taken, as we've already seen, a problem-solving approach to this. So that is the enforcement around the use of the vehicle, but also then around the modifications made to the vehicle. We know that they tint their glasses, they modify exhaust systems. We're also taking the problem-solving of taking these modifications back to their insurers because they don't inform on this, and in many cases the cars are not actually insured because of the modifications made. So it's very much problem solving around that enforcement, dispersal, and then looking to try and prevent this by actually removing the insurance, and if they have no insurance, we remove the vehicle. So to give the reassurance, we're very much sighted on the scale of this challenge, and its combination between local districts and OSU support.
So the message needs to go out to those people in the communities that if they're not careful now, they really are going to suffer in terms of their insurance, of their vehicles, and so on.
Absolutely correct. Yes.
Thank you. And I noticed on page 25, you're talking about the Hoyland Neighbourhood Policing Team, and I know this has been very well received in the area there. And I've had Zoom and Skype meetings now with both Stephanie Peacock, the MP for East Barnsley, and with John Healy MP as well, all around these issues of speeding from Dearne Valley Parkway to Darfield and so on. So I'm glad to hear that we're all across that. Thank you very much. Shall I move on then to 8? And this is the heading Tackling Crime and Delivering an Excellent Victim-Led Service. And 8.1 is about domestic abuse. You've obviously had some good results on domestic abuse. You've got dedicated teams and a dedicated detective, inspector driving the improvements. That, again, I wonder if you could just say a little bit around that, and in particular whether you're feeling the impact of the present situation in the courts, the growth of courts and the criminal justice system, whether that's impacting you.
Absolutely, Commissioner. I think one, I'd reflect that Barnsley implemented the dedicated team in 2019, was the first district in South Yorkshire to do so. I think we are benefiting from that early implementation. We've embedded the team now. We have, as you say, the dedicated DI. We've been looking at throughout the last 6 months, particularly during COVID, how we can maximise the impact of that team positively. It's a key priority for us locally. It isn't just the DA team. All of the response teams have had specific training around key indicators, key signals, and the importance of positive action when we're attending events or issues that have been reported to us. We've seen a huge increase in terms of the number of arrests that we've made around this in terms of positive action at scenes. So we've gone from 40% to about 55.5%, I think is the latest up-to-date figure in terms of embedded level of action taken at scenes to protect victims. And in terms of positive outcomes and actions, so where we've worked with the victim to deliver protection or prosecution against offenders, or sometimes it might be that it's education and intervention to help where that's required because of other external issues. We've seen that rise from 14% to an average of 24%, and currently in August that's at 31%. So that's an enormous success story, but it's not one that we want to rest on our laurels with. We are currently going through training with all of the staff across the district around this to make sure that they understand some of the detail behind how this can impact and play out and how to improve the effective nature of our investigation. So our specialist DA team are holding some training and briefing meetings with all of our, especially with our newer staff that we mentioned earlier, to make sure that they're aware of those key signs and key indicators. And I think all of that together is having that really positive impact in terms of, yes, the reactive work we're doing in terms of catching and detecting this, but we're also developing this around the violence reduction unit with BMBC in terms of the proactive work we can take to drive down the number of reports we get in the long term.
Yeah. Yes, I know you referenced the VRU area profile, and I'm glad that information there exists to you. Do you have the IDVAs integrated into the teams in some way?
Yes, they were based here at Churchill's with us. Clearly that's been impacted by COVID. So there's been a bit of displacement through the COVID period. They are currently still working with us, but from a different perspective in terms of having to do some of the linkage and work from home. But we're hoping that as the lockdown continues to lift, we can get them re-engaged from physical as well as operational basis.
Yeah, thank you. Coming towards the end here, on page 29, your future focus, not necessarily for you to comment now, but I'm glad you've got your second bullet point, maintaining our reduced levels of burglary. The two issues that come to me most often are around antisocial behaviour, the speeding, which you've already mentioned, and in second place is burglary, which has started to creep up again, I think, in people's areas of concern. Just something to note there.
Yes, I would agree.
Sorry?
I was going to say I would agree. I don't think there's many good things to come out of COVID. The reduced levels of burglary are one of them, and the challenge for us is to maintain those reductions, which I think we are currently successfully doing, but we need to embed that over the coming months.
Yeah, thank you. The final thing I just wanted to comment on page 30, the outstanding bravery of PC Stephen Miller. I read that, and it was an amazing thing that he did, so congratulations to him, I think.
Yes, I think that puts the human face on what the police officers are out there doing every day. We could have chosen a number to do that. Stevens was clearly outstanding. We will be putting him forward for Force Awards and potentially for the Humane Society as well. Absolutely.
Thank you. Is there anything else you wanted to comment on that we've not touched? You don't have to, but I wanted to give you a chance if you did.
No, I think the report, everybody will have read it. I think as a summary, I think Barnsley has remained working really well through the COVID period, and that's a testimony to our staff. There is an element in the report that talks about the limited number of shielders we've had and the low level of abstractions that we've had, and that's a real testimony to the public service of all the officers. They've been here and continuing the best service they can deliver during this time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Does anybody else want to say anything about that report? If not, thank you very much, Mark, and you may want to go and keep Barnsley safe rather than...
Thank you, Commissioner. I will do. We've got, as usual, our usual daily challenges.
Thank you very much. Shall we move then on in the agenda to item 11, which is forced performance of police and crime?
Temporary Superintendent Mark James.
And
has left the conference.
The priority in the police and crime plan that we're looking at today is protecting vulnerable people. And I don't know whether this is Mark that's going to introduce this. Perhaps I could just say before we begin a couple of things. One is thank you for the report. I think if in future, when we do these reports, if we could have the headings made clear, it was just a little tricky to see when we were moving from one thing to another. So if we could have some sort of headlines going through just to break up the text a little bit, that would be very helpful. And the other thing was, in the police and crime plan, you quite rightly say on page 1.1 that the PVP priority focuses on, and then you list a number of bullet points. Not all of those are covered in the report, and I was particularly surprised to see there was very little reference to cybercrime, to county lines, CSE, and human trafficking and modern slavery. I didn't see anything in there at all, and I was a little surprised about that. That may be something you want to pick up. But if we go into the report itself, and then you can come back and challenge me on any of those things. But on page 32, Operation Encompass, it's a similar question to what we were talking about before with the schools in Barnsley, and just wondering what the position was across the piece, because I guess this has caused issues in other districts and not just in Barnsley. Mark, if you just comment on that a little, or the Chief.
Well, I'm going to hand over to ACC Poultney just to do the report, Alan, but in terms of the content, of course, there's a balance to be struck here. I mean, we have had some very, very lengthy reports, which is great because it puts the detail. I think if we aim to cover every heading under the plan again, it would lead to a very lengthy report. So if ever there's any areas of particular interest, if you flag them to us via the office, then we'll make sure we give an appropriate detailed brief. But as we currently stand, of course, we just need to be selective, and everything will be reported on during the course of the year. And many of these are strategic issues. But if there is something that you aren't particularly dealing with, then of course let us know and we'll deal with it. But if I hand over to Lauren for the detail on Encompass.
Just before you move off from that, the things I'm interested in are the ones in the police and crime plan. So they're the bullet points that you quite rightly notch up on in 1.1. But I don't want to labour this, Mark. It's just a comment.
No, absolutely. But as I say, if there's particular ones, but I'm sure you appreciate if we went in detail on every one of those points every time in the reports, then they would be even more lengthy. So we're more than happy to do that if that's what you want. But then I know previously we've had discussions about the length of the report. So we can sort it out with the office to make sure that we cover what it is you need. Suffice to say, there's a lot of activity in all those areas. So if there is anything you'd like supplementary, I'd be more than happy to let you have it.
Fine, no problem. Lauren. Or perhaps not, Lauren.
We're now off mute.
Yep.
Sorry, somebody muted me. I'm told it was accidental. So, in relation to the Operation Encompass, despite lockdown, we have been continuing to make those referrals that lockdown conditions have impacted on the ability of schools to follow those through because of their limited interaction with some children. I'm assured, though, that the referrals have continued to take place through lockdown, and some of the technical issues that we have seen should be resolved by the start of the new academic year, which is coming up in just, I think, about 3 weeks' time. So we anticipate that Operation Encompass will really escalate come September.
Do we have any idea of how many schools are reached by Operation Encompass and how many aren't? And whether those who aren't involved, whether they are actually resisting this or whether they simply haven't been approached yet or quite what?
This was discussed at the last local county-wide safeguarding board, and my recollection is that in a couple of districts, pretty much all of the schools are signed up. There's one district where the coverage is not as intense, but there's work ongoing to take it there, and all the local authority partners seem really engaged with it. So it is being monitored through the county-wide safeguarding board, but unfortunately there's specific details I don't have right in front of me at this moment.
Okay, thank you. I'll take you to page 33, and at the top, it's the point that we were talking about in relation to the Barnsley district, domestic abuse teams within each district. And I wondered, again, whether the involvement of IDVAs is the same across the piece or whether it's different in different districts.
My understanding is that we have a similar offer across all the districts.
So the domestic abuse approach, the approach to domestic abuse is replicated across each of the districts the same, or we're trying to get
it. There's a consistent approach, Commissioner. Obviously, there's different sizes of the districts or reflect the volumes in it, but as per the previous answer around the neighbourhood teams, we'll try to have a consistent model. We expect that of the districts, but equally when you work in partnership, there's got to be a degree of flexibility without bending ourselves out of shape to make sure that we provide a commensurate service relevant to the local context.
Yeah.
Apologies, Commissioner, I had to step out of the room for the previous update to deal with an operational call, so I missed the context of that one. But in relation to our domestic abuse teams, they're all standardised in sort of principle and governance, although they obviously flex according to local needs. And I think that actually the investment in the domestic abuse teams, which really recognises the pernicious threat of domestic abuse, is really positive, and we're taking real steps to develop our domestic abuse offerings for both victims and for offenders. And I think that the other point to recognise coming out of this investment is that as well as giving an enhanced service around domestic abuse, taking those domestic abuse inquiries out of the standard PVP team gives the PVT team some greater resilience to focus on non-DA offences as well, which we know has been a real issue at times.
Yeah. No, the reason for part of the reason for asking was because if this is something that is making a difference, then why would you not want to do it across the piece? But also it enables us to see whether we're comparing like with like when we look at what's happening in the different districts in relation to domestic abuse. If I move you on, again, it's as with the Barnsley report, if there are things that you want to come back to, then we'll do that at the end. But moving you on to page 34, hate crime. This isn't actually in the report, but my understanding is that hate crime has gone up since the period of the COVID period, if we put it that way. And in particular, race hate crimes have gone up a lot. It doesn't say it in the report, but that's my understanding. I wonder if you could say a word around that and why you think that should be.
There has been an increase in hate crime reporting during the period of lockdown, and race hate crime is one that has significantly increased. Some of that is specifically related to COVID, with COVID being a key word that's been in some of the sort of searches around that, and there's been some sort of targeted offences against individuals who are associated with some of the COVID generating countries effectively. What we've also seen is an update, an increase in some of those race hate crimes are actually crimes reported against white people, and that was about the time of the George Floyd killing, and we think that effectively that raised perception in the public, led to some people recording offences ordinarily see reported.
Interesting. Thank you. Page 36, so it is a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the report. 3.29, no PAB would be complete without a reference to 101 and the call handling. I wondered here, specifically around, it talks about the average wait times coming down, which is good news, of course. I wondered whether you felt that the callback assist had made any difference here, and whether it was being used, and whether you've got some sense of how well it's used and what difference it's made.
I think generally the update around callback assist is that it makes a difference because people are choosing to get a call back rather than wait for extended periods. So that does help the demand to be managed more effectively.
Yeah, I think it's now routinely used, Commissioner. It's there, it's stable. It's one of the things I think everyone would recognise has been considerable improvement in the performance of Atlas Court as the systems have embedded. We've improved the staffing levels. They're aware that there's a further uplift in staffing, and I think the management there is very effective, making sure we flex to meet the demand. The perennial issue is, of course, that where we have peaks of demand, and I think over the weekend we saw a considerable number of incidents. When we get that surge, and it can be down to what the weather is, we will always struggle to some degree to maintain the best levels of service because you simply can't have that number of staff on all the time. So I think the position is a lot better. Let's start better management, better performance information, better systems. Well, as I say, we'll always suffer when you get unexpected peaks of demand.
Commissioner, just to, I was looking at Atlas performance only a few moments ago, and just to give a sense around some of that demand, on the 31st of July we had 1,039 calls for service. On the 1st of August we had just short of 1,500 101 calls, and just specifically around callback assist, in sort of the last fortnight of performance, there's been over 4,600 activations of callback assist, and on the 4th of August, on that one day, we saw 507 members of the public selecting that as an option. So it is well used and embedded within our service offer from Atlas.
I think just to cap it off, if I can, Commissioner, obviously the call handling function is one element. The end purpose, of course, is for a member of the public to get the service that they require, particularly when it's in an emergency situation. So if we look at our performance in terms of 999 calls, the emergency calls, we now get to those very promptly, well within the 15-minute target in the vast majority of cases. And I think we probably respond to 999 calls around about 2 minutes quicker than we previously were doing. When you look at the priority calls, where the aspiration is to get there within an hour, I think looking back over performance, we've actually improved the overall performance by around 50 minutes. So I think when you look at what the end result is, a member of the public gets an officer to attend promptly when they need us, the overall performance has shown quite a staggering improvement.
Yes, I mean, if my emails are anything to judge by, we're nowhere near the position we were only a few years ago when we were just inundated all the time. We don't get that now. They're getting rarer. The emails about 101 specifically. They do, of course, peak when demand peaks, and we know that demand peaks at certain times of the week, and when certain incidents happen, everybody phones in about the incident. So we understand all of that, but it's just, as with many things, the arrival of coronavirus has really sort of disrupted a lot of progress that was being made, I think, in a lot of areas, and it's such a shame. But I mean, terrible disease and all of that, but it has had this impact on the organisation.
Yeah, and we need to continually educate the public. I think if we try and remember back to the start of the COVID, when the government first announced regulation, we actually, I think, had more calls on that night than we would on New Year's Eve. And that was people ringing up asking us to explain what the regulation was. So we do need to have a continued education about when to ring the police, what is it for us to deal with, and what other services are out there for people. But that's just an ongoing thing that we need to continually try and educate people with, and offer different means they can communicate with us, such as online, which, you know, we've done to some success during the pandemic. It's one of the benefits to come out of it, but that's just an ongoing process.
Yes, and of course it would help if we had absolute clarity from government announcement, and more of those to come, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything else on the report that I wanted to comment on specifically, but I don't know whether Lauren or Deputy Chief, whether you want to point to anything.
I've just, while that discussion's been taking place, just gone into the performance report from Performance Day last week, which I believe Kevin represents you at. Just look at the hate crime information that's on there. So just in relation to the overall stats, total hate crime is up by 15%, with hate crime being up by 19%. So our quarter one this year was 22% higher than quarter one last year, with June being the highest level seen in any month this year. Race hate crime represents currently 67% of all hate crime reported. And in June we had 249 specific incidents recorded to us. And we do have a higher number of white victims reporting race hate in June. And just the mention that I made about hate associated with COVID, 9% of hate crime offences since February have had COVID linked to them.
Yeah, so not a huge number of COVID related.
Well, 9% since February, so I think the monthly average is about 150 a month.
Right, okay. So there has been some increase in hate. There is an increase in hate crime and race hate crime in particular.
Yes, particularly in June, which is, of course, when we saw a lot of protests taking place.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Did anyone else want to comment on that report? If not, sorry. Was that someone leaving?
Commissioner, it was Sophie. I think I was speaking at the same time as someone else, but I'm not sure who. It was just in relation to callback assist. I was just going to go back to that because just to let you know, obviously, I've confirmed that on the back of the success of callback assist, you've just approved some additional licences, which have been through the normal business process. So that should help as well with the demand in future.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I think that's everything on item 11. So do we come to item 12? And Debbie, this is going to be over to you, I think. And this is the budget monitoring report for June. And do you want to say a brief word about it?
Yes, I will do. If I can just point out the overall position, which is on the first page, on page 39, that the projected outturn is a £2.56 million overspend, which coincidentally is equivalent to the COVID spend, 2.56 million, and that is just a coincidence. And the table on page 40 breaks that down by expenditure type. The three areas I would just say a few words around are police pay, staff pay, and income. Police pay, unusually, we are seeing a projected overspend of £0.83 million. This is largely due to being over on police officer strength at the start of the year and having fewer leavers than projected. We clearly need to keep this under review. The leavers may just be a short-term blip. It could even be COVID-related. But just by way of background, we have previously projected 9 other leavers per month. We increased that to 10. It's currently at 11. And it might be that we need to revise that downwards. So that's just something that we just need to keep an eye on in the short term. And police officer overtime is projecting an overspend of £1.95 million. 1.1 of that is COVID related, and I will come on to talk about COVID separately. But in addition to this, there are other operational demands as well. It's probably just worth adding that we are scrutinising overtime at the moment. We've done a big exercise looking at the COVID overtime, and we are looking at the wider spending as well on overtime at the moment, and FCT will be fully cited on this.
I know we're keeping a separate note of COVID expenditure, but we don't know yet, do we, whether we're going to get some of that back or all of it back or none of it back?
Well, since we've prepared the report, we have had confirmation that we can reclaim the medical grade PPE, and we did submit a claim for that on Friday. That claim was for £469,000. It didn't include the national PPE that was procured, so that's £775,000 worth of national PPE, but that will be dealt with separately. So we do expect to get back £1.25 million worth of funding for PPE, but there's nothing suggested at the moment that we will get any funding for anything other than the PPE. So this is an area, again, that we need to look at as to how we are going to fund that in the current year, and also assess the impact on future years, because I'm sure there will be some spillover into future years of what's happening now. Some of that will become our business as usual, so that's a piece of work that we need to do as part of budget setting this year. Yeah.
On page, sorry, I'm going to take you on to page 40 at the top, COVID-19, that little box there, and we talk about COVID-19 is having an impact on income recovery, and I wonder if you could expand that a little. Is that, does that include, are you including in there the position with regard to council tax and the council tax base?
No, this is just purely income that we bill, we receive, and we bring into force. The council tax is separate. That is funding to us rather than the income. It's not part of our budget that we monitor routinely. So that will have an impact on council tax.
Yeah, this would include things like speed awareness courses.
That's right, yes. So as you can see in the table at 3.2, we have a projected shortfall of £1.3 million. And on page 41 near the bottom, we start to analyse some of that. Speed awareness is in there. That's 0.2 million. There are also other areas: immigration, accident records, court prosecution income from concerts, festivals, shopping centres. So all of these areas it's having an impact, and these are the areas that we need to look at to say it's having an impact in the current year, but potentially it could have an impact in future years as well, and we need to assess this as part of budget setting.
There's a bit of a trade-off, is there, between not having to call on a lot of overtime for some of these big events that aren't going to take place, and not having the income from it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, some of the areas that specifically you would expect that there are there is lower spending in those areas. Probably no spending in terms of concerts and festivals. So yes, there is a trade-off between the expenditure and the income in those areas.
I must say, I didn't realise that the speed awareness course income all came to SYP, or perhaps it doesn't all come to SYP.
I believe it does now. We reviewed the way the Safety Camera Partnership works, and that now sits with Force. It used to be outside of Force, so yes, my understanding is it does come into Force now.
Okay. Thank you. I don't think I've got anything else to say on that report, Debbie, other than to thank you for it, unless there's something else you want to point us to.
I would just add that from a capital point of view, we have just concluded a piece of work that myself, Jackie Bland, Sophie Abbott have been involved in. Obviously, we brought some scrutiny to the current capital plan, looked at the achievability of it, the interdependencies, and we've now concluded that. So we will get back into the routine now of presenting more helpful, I suppose, monitoring information around capital spending.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got a more realistic programme now, haven't we?
Yes.
Well,
and that was the purpose of the exercise, and that has just concluded really in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah.
So no, there isn't really anything else. I've mentioned in terms of COVID, the claim for the PPE, and we are capturing the costs and we're reporting those to the Home Office monthly, and that's all we can continue to do at this stage. Yeah.
Well, on the dial-in with the civil service last week, there wasn't much by way of encouragement that we'd be getting much more for COVID costs, but they were clear though that you should keep the tally of those as a separate account. Thank you very much for that, Debbie. Item 13 then, Police Officer Uplift Programme. And again, Debbie, this is you. And I wonder if you wanted to say a brief word of introduction to that.
Well, we tried to break the report down into, firstly, the background, what happened last year and where we are currently. So, if I include the background, then we all know that the government announced plans to uplift officers nationally by 20,000. We had our number confirmed as 151 in that first tranche, and the table
has left the conference.
Shows our plan, which in addition to the national uplift, we'd also committed to a force uplift of 220. So that was our recruitment plan in terms of uplifting the officer numbers. This was communicated to the Home Office. The Home Office, however, wanted forces to achieve a third of their target. So they did set as a target of 50 as opposed to the 30 in 1920. Then over the page on 46, we go into the 1920 position. So against the target head count of 2512 in that table there, we achieved a 2477. So we did have a shortfall of 35. There were a number of factors that caused that. One being the counting method that the Home Office use, that we use our annual data return, which is a head count, and it includes career breaks and secondments that we wouldn't normally include in our numbers because they're not deployable strengths. So that's a big factor in this, but there are other factors in there as well. So we're just pointing out that we didn't hit the target, but we've since put plans in place to make sure in the current year we do achieve, and actually we're aiming to overachieve. And in doing so, we have managed to use the Ring Fence Police Uplift Programme grants, which we didn't know about this at the time of setting the budget, so we didn't actually factor it into our budgetary plans. But that's £4.2 million. The Home Office have since confirmed 50% of that. So we've got to £2.1 million that we know we're getting to spend on uplift. And that has allowed us to increase the number of recruits and bring forward some intakes as well from later into the year, bring forward to September and October. So we've learnt from 1920, and we've put plans to make sure we achieve those numbers in the current year and maximise that grant.
Yeah. And so as things stand, we've no reason to suppose that we're not going to achieve these figures by 2023.
No, I mean, COVID, as you would expect, has created challenges around recruitment and training. Even just thinking about the training centre and the work that has to be done there, work has paused because of COVID. I mean, contractors have not been able to come on site. So there have been numerous challenges around that, but it is still full steam ahead with recruiting. And as I say, bringing forward the recruitment and the additional recruits. And actually, what I've just referred to in the budget monitoring report, where we've had fewer leavers at the start of the year, whilst that creates as a headache from a budgetary point of view, it actually makes this position better. So it's sort of, plus and a minus on that one.
I mean, the government said uplift is its top priority, that it wants to see numbers of police officers increase, and it's been very clear about that, and it's given all police forces a number to achieve. Is it your understanding, Debbie, that all the costs of that will be covered by government grant, including, inevitably, the support services that you need to support that number of officers?
To be fair, I think there's this lack of clarity. We've only had our 151 confirmed in terms of the numbers that we need to achieve. And beyond that, we are making assumptions. For the 487 that we're assuming in this paper, that is just an assumption. There's no confirmation on that number. So in my view, this does lack a lot of clarity in terms of what the government will fund and what those numbers are and what that means to South Yorkshire Police. So we are really just waiting for that further clarity. And I'm really not sure when that is expected. I sort of heard that we might have some more clarity in the summertime, but it is just a wait and see at the moment. But you're right to point out that when you're uplifting officers, logically, that does have an impact on your support functions and everything else that goes along with it. And if they just fund the police officer numbers, that again will create a challenge for the force in balancing the budget.
Yes, exactly. And it would be tragic if the uplift was achieved at the expense of something else, which is equally important for the force.
Yeah.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to comment on item 13?
Commissioner, it's Sophie. It was just to say, really, in terms of the CSR moving forward, the government have said that they're still wedded to the uplift, as outlined in their manifesto. But initially, they've told us that there was sufficient money in infrastructure costs for 6,500 police staff nationally to support the uplift. But just to let you know that's one of the areas that we do have concerns about moving forward, and whether those infrastructure costs and police staff costs will still be supported. But it's something that we're working on nationally through our various organisations and putting back to the Home Office and ministers in the bids for the CSR. There are a number of other considerations as well that you mentioned before, and uncertainties. For example, the McLeod ruling, the council tax base, and COVID-19 reimbursement, legacy issues, etc. But certainly the supporting infrastructure for the uplift is something that's really up there on the agenda to be taken forward.
Yeah, I think it's something we've got to increasingly talk about, but if we talk about an extra 20,000 police officers, we've also got to talk about an extra 6,500 support staff. Otherwise, it's a meaningless talk. It'll have an undesirable impact on force budgets going forward. Okay. Anything else on item 13? Thank you very much, Debbie, for those. Shall we move then on the agenda to Chief Executive reporting? Item 14 is PCC decisions that have been taken since the last PAB. Erica, is there anything on that, or Sophie? Anything on there you want to draw us?
Has left the conference.
Thanks, Commissioner. Yes, you've made a number of decisions in the last Public Accountability Board, and a summary of those that we think that we want to draw to the attention of the public are set out on page 50 of the pack. We've already talked about the callback assist and the technology into Atlas Court. Also, we've just discussed COVID spend and police officer recruitment. So the remaining decisions are around your community grant scheme, NDORS, which is the driver training as an alternative to court and prosecution to offender motorists. And then finally, the wellbeing strategy, where you've approved capital expenditure for the purchase of health kiosks to monitor staff's physical wellbeing. So that's a quick run through that report. If anybody wants to ask any questions, happy to take those, Commissioner.
Are there any questions or comments from anyone? If not, thank you very much, Erica, for that. So we move to item 15, which is the separate, came as a separate agenda pack. South Yorkshire Police and Crime Commissioner, Policing COVID-19 report by the South Yorkshire Independent Ethics Panel. I've just noticed we've managed to turn the white Yorkshire Rose upside down on that. That's an achievement. So if we come to that, Andrew, this is your Independent Ethics Panel report. Perhaps I could say, before you just say a few words about it, that I did find it a very good, interesting, and very comprehensive, very full report. The reason I asked for it is because we were aware that COVID and all the emergency regulations and the restrictions that followed from that was going to put the police in a very challenging and a very difficult place. And we wanted to see whether the police on the whole got that balance right between enforcement and encouragement and engagement and education and so on, and other issues too. So that was the purpose of asking the Independent Ethics Panel to have a look at this and to keep an eye on it. And thank you for doing it, and for doing it in a timely way, because you have had to work very hard to get this together. So Andrew, do you want to say a word?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. I won't make this a long report. It's worth making a few short points. So this is an independent look at policing COVID in South Yorkshire. Most of our reports we attempt to be evidence-based, and this is no exception. We obviously weren't able, in this context, to do empirical observation in the way we might normally do. But our sources of information are set out in paragraph 1.4 for anyone who wonders what they are. And as we comment there, the consistency of the picture available from the information we looked at is striking. And that's one of the reasons, probably the main reason, why we were able to produce in section 8 almost entirely positive conclusions about the way in which COVID-19 has been policed in South Yorkshire. The report in section 7 suggests areas which SYP might consider for further evaluation, and it includes perhaps the most high-profile issue, which is the number of fixed penalty notices issued to minority ethnic citizens in South Yorkshire. I understand that the force is already on to the points we've suggested need evaluation, and it may be that one of the senior command team can bring you up to date on steps that have been taken. I think that's all I need to say, other than to underline, as you have done in your forward, the final paragraph of 8.12, which is this: our assessment of the available evidence is that the public generally has a high level of trust and confidence in SYP in the COVID context, and there is widespread consent for the manner in which the county is being policed. I'm happy to take questions, obviously, and but I suspect that the force itself may wish to make some comments, as I've indicated.
Thank you. Thank you for the report. Yes, Chief Constable or Deputy, do you want to say anything?
Yes, thank you. Thank you to Andrew and his panel for the completion of the report. And as you say, they've worked very hard to produce a timely report because, of course, in the normal course of events, it may well have been the case, had it not been for their very welcome industry, that the report might have appeared rather after the fact. But actually, having read the report, even if that had been the case, I still think it points to a useful, independent observation as to the record, if you like, because it is the case that, and the report faithfully points to this, these are unprecedented events, and the forces had to adapt in an unprecedented way as a result. But of course, with all of these things, one wants to make sure that the lessons that are there to be learned are learned, and that we bake that into our future abilities to respond to similar or variants on the theme. A couple of the key issues that I would point to. Firstly, I do think that the report faithfully reflects what I would consider to be a really good example of the adaptability and the resilience of the force to difficult circumstances. ACC David Hartley, as our Gold Commander, I think takes a lot of credit in terms of the infrastructure that has been very quickly stood up within the force to manage all manner of COVID-related consideration, and that includes policy, practice, issues of staffing, making sure that we bake in resilience and business continuity, oversee the making of our workplaces COVID compliant, and distribution.
Has left the conference.
The panoply of focus, if you like, of the COVID hub is quite significant, and I actually think that it is the tightest and most well run of COVID-related responses that I have seen. And you may well say, well, I would say that, wouldn't I? But I think credit where it's due in terms of that which I think we've been able to observe, and I think the report reflects that. Similarly, I am genuinely gratified for the report's acknowledgement of the fact that which we set out to do in terms of the spirit with which we would engage the public in upholding the regulations has been faithfully carried out. We have, of course, always sought to ensure that we demonstrate that we working with the public are part and parcel of getting us all through what is a dreadful set of circumstances and getting ourselves to the other side of this where we would all wish to be, and to do so in a way that enhances rather than damages confidence in SYP. And that very much underpins almost the attitudinal response to what it is that we've sought to do. In terms of enforcement, which again is very clearly the last of the options that we have sought to engage, the report again demonstrates that actually enforcement has had to be taken in comparatively very, very few scenarios when you consider the global size of the population in South Yorkshire and the number of enforcement activities that have had to be carried out. They are minimal. Similarly, if you look at complaints data and what have you, that similarly points to those powers having been effectively, fairly and respectfully put in place. The point that I think Andrew absolutely right to raise is that there is a clear disparity in terms of members of BAME communities and their likelihood to be on the receiving end of enforcement activity. There is disproportionality there. And of course, that is something that we are working to better understand. And what I would say, without racing to the conclusion, is that it does have to be borne in mind that there is a very clear correlation between areas where most complaints not about enforcement, but about complaints of lack of enforcement have come from. Those areas have been Hexthorpe, Page Hall. Enforcement in those areas reflects the activity of communities who are predominantly BAME. And actually, if you look at the prevalence of COVID in South Yorkshire, they too are in those geographic locations. So in a sense, the concern expressed by the public, the actual prevalence of COVID and the presence of minority communities all stack up in a sense of, if we are going to be upholding COVID regulations, where else would we be doing it? And so there is some absolute empirical justification for the points of focus and the absence of complaints by those receiving the enforcement activity speaks, I think, to the way in which it has been done. We do recognise that a lot of the early concerns, many of which were addressed, not through having to go to enforcement, but through better engagement and education, were about lack of understanding, language difficulties, and what have you. And again, the report, faithful reports on the efforts that we took, not least through engaging with members of the community, university students with particular language skills, production of leaflets in different languages and what have you, to try and bring the education point very much to the fore. And so whilst there is a disparity, it seems to me that disparity can be justified. What we want to do, however, is get beyond my drawing those conclusions by doing a little more work, and not least with our IAGs through the Stand and Stop and Search group, just to make sure that we can triangulate our assertions with evidence, which I suspect that we can do. And the last point that I would make, again, just in emphasising my thanks to the panel, is I do think that as a record, if you like, of what has been done and the observations that have been made, that then stands as something which I know David and his team will fall upon, such as to improve current practice, because we're not out of the woods yet, as we know, but will absolutely inform future iterations of a similar sort of endeavour. So I guess those would be my principal comments. So thanks once again to Andrew and the team.
Thank you. Andrew, do you want to respond to anything there?
No, I'm obviously grateful that the Chief and no doubt senior colleagues have found this useful and that it may stand as like a document of record. That's exactly what one would hope. Whether or not future members of the panel after the membership change at the end of next month will be called upon to sort of do report number 2 on any further developments is not a matter, of course, for us. I think it's sensible to have drawn a line at June the 30th, and I'm glad we didn't attempt to go beyond that. So thank you the Chief for his remarks.
Yes, and thanks, my thanks to the panel as well, because I think this is a meticulous report and it documents this period very well. And when you think of what has happened in some other parts of the country, the response of the force here could have been very different, and it could have had some very different outcomes. But congratulations to people. I think they have kept the public on the side of the force in a time when it could have been damaged. Confidence and trust, and we thank everybody for that. So thank you, Andrew, for the report. Perhaps you could pass our thanks to the panel members.
I will. Thank you very much.
I think that covers everything under 15. Shall we go then to 16, which is PCC's engagement with black communities as a result of the Black Lives Matter protests? And I'll just say a very brief word, and Fiona may want to say a brief word as well. This all arose as everybody will recall, because of the death of George Floyd in the United States of America, we saw the rise of the Black Lives Movement. And I was approached by BLM supporters in South Yorkshire, particularly in Sheffield, and they wanted to discuss these issues with reference to the local situation. So we had an initial meeting. It was a 2-hour meeting, a Zoom meeting, very good meeting. They made some very sharp and very good points, and essentially we were there just to listen to what they were saying. So it was very challenging, but it was also constructive and useful, and we said that we will go on meeting and taking things forward. There's a general feel on the part of everybody who took part in that the last thing we want is to have to replicate this in a few years' time and go over the same ground in a few years' time. So we are planning some further meetings, and the report reflects that. Fiona, is there anything you want to say or add?
Yeah, I'll just add on there. It was, the meeting came as a result of the community themselves, and they'd had an initial meeting with over 50 members of their community. So the smaller group that we met with was a representative sample of that discussions that they'd had. And there were some very strong feelings, but some very, very good discussions as well. And I think hopefully it will lead to this development of a relationship where we can get continued engagement, and also some more opportunities for the community to be involved in our assurance panels going forward, and have some input into how we make decisions and help us make some changes, necessary changes if there are any. I think as well going forward, it wasn't just for ourselves. They were interested in talking to the council, and they're very interested in the wider criminal justice service, and we'll be hoping that future discussions will involve members of those communities, such as the organisations criminal justice wise, such as the youth offending teams, crime prosecution service, probation service, and others.
Thank you. Does anybody want to say anything? Anyone from the force?
Not specifically, Ellen, other than to simply reflect on the fact that, of course, it's so important, isn't it, to continue our engagement with all manner of our communities, who, in particular, those who might, fear that, broader injustice and what have you impacts the way in which they are being dealt with by the police and what have you. And needless to say, I of course do not agree with everything that is said in this space, and in fact I find much to disagree with. But that said, it would be entirely churlish and I think irresponsible not to listen in good faith, not least because we know, of course, that we are always far from perfect, and there's much we can do to improve. And even if that is simply about the quality of dialogue, then that is something to work upon. But I think it is a positive first steps, and of course we, with you, stand ready to engage with anybody in good faith and do so in a non-defensive and very fulsome way.
Yeah, and of course it wasn't the BAME representative group. This was specifically black people from our communities, so that's Black British, Black African, and African Caribbean. So it was a very specific group, and actually one that is not that big in South Yorkshire, but it was a good meeting and a constructive meeting, and we'll go on meeting and see what comes from it. Thank you very much. I think that brings us to the final area, which is 17, PAB work programme. Erica, is there anything to say or to add? Or
No, nothing else, Commissioner. Thank you.
Thank you. Item 18, is there any other business? Oh, which has been notified. Well, none has been notified, so there isn't any other business. So thank you very much indeed, everyone. The next meeting is on the 10th of September 2020. We very much hope we can have something that enables us to see one another, whether it's a Teams or Zoom or Skype or whatever, rather than simply this dial-in. But thank you very much for your attendance today.